start streaming us. I'm going to also try to make sure that I turn off. I should have done this before, but I got to stop my OneDrive from syncing, so I don't.
Oh, full house.
Here we go. Our blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And see if I can just change that to stop syncing. Okay, so thanks for joining us. I don't think I'm going to use the full hour today. I wanted to pick a topic that was, but I always say that and then we'll see how it goes. But I wanted to pick last time we did a fairly full topic. It's a very specific idea, but it was philosophical. And it was an idea that has been explored philosophically for centuries and for large dissertations and monographs. So that was complicated. But for today, and here, let me just make sure. Let me just make sure I can see everybody. Oh, way more. I'm sorry. I thought it was. My screen just showed a few of us. So, hello, everybody. I should say hi to everybody. I'm seeing you there, and welcome. So, if Zoom cuts us off, be prepared. Here we go. This probably an idea that you've thought about before. And I'm going to share my screen, cancel, and share screen to show you what I have in mind. There we go. I want to suggest a way that I think that the way I think of ritual purity and impurity. So I think that this course was, 7 or 8 things that it does. I'm not suggesting that you misunderstand them. I'm suggesting that people who pick up the Torah maybe misunderstand them. So, I got an email recently and anyway, I don't want to betray a confidence, but let me rephrase it. I think that most people who pick up the Bible, and it's not just a matter of not knowing the Hebrew, they really don't have a clue as to what's going on. Now, you could say I have the benefit of our commentary tradition, and I think that's part of it. I don't think you have to know Rashi to know what's going on, but it's helpful to know what Rashi and the other rabbis are pointing to, and to say, look, this is a place where we have a discussion about what something means. The Bible is not full of answers. It's full of a combination of questions and discussions, and some answers. I mean, it does. I'm not saying that when it says that you should keep Shabbat, that's just a question. I mean, it's saying you should keep Shabbat. But what does it really mean to keep Shabbat? What are the rules of Shabbat? What's its purpose? Why is it called a sign? It generates a ton of questions. So I think most people will pick up the Torah, as you know well, they don't understand it. They think that Adam is a person. So Adam was a person who got created. But they don't know that the rabbis of our tradition don't necessarily read it that way. They might see the word Adam as just talking about the creation of humanity. They could talk about what it means as how did the image of God within the human being emerge over an evolution from animals? And we looked at a quote that I love about, maybe it was in this course or another, I often use it, my favorite midrash, which is that when God said, let us make the human, God was talking to all of the things that had already been created, and then asked it, and they said, well, why are you talking to us? And God said, I need you all to contribute something that I'm going to make the human out of, which is a fascinating thing when you think our DNA is actually made out of genetic material that came from other organisms. They came from previous incarnations of organisms and came from organisms that merged together to make a communal organism that was an ancient ancestor of ours, so that we do incorporate genetic material from ancient eukaryocytes and bacteria and other life forms preserved in our DNA. And so that the idea that, well, that's just a modern reading. Well, it's not necessarily a modern reading. What makes you think you know what the Bible is saying just because you read in the English, God made Adam? Well, that looks like a proper name. So it's a guy named Adam. And could it well be that you are just really, really influenced by the movie Frankenstein? And that like your brain is working based on the context of the Frankenstein myth, and you're just seeing God as the mad scientist putting Adam together. The rabbis didn't necessarily see it that way. And if you read the largest section of theology in the Middle Ages that we produced, the Zohar, very, very, very long, they actually don't see the Adam as the creation of the human being at all, or as an actual physical organism. They actually view the creation of Adam as actually as Adam Kadmon, the creation of the primordial Adam, which is actually the energy signature of the cosmos. So they actually view Genesis 1 as a version of the Big Bang that many of you have already known and studied, which is that it's describing God producing an explosion from within God that creates the fragments of energy that produce the universe. And therefore, the story of Adam within it is not the story of the creation of a human being. It is actually the story of, it's a disguised story of the process of the creation of the galaxies and of what you and I call physics. So it's really easy to pick up the Torah and just be like, I know what it means. Adam was a person, Eve was made from half of Adam, and therefore Eve serves Adam, and anything else is just not reading it the way God intended it. And so when we look at Leviticus chapter 12, I'm going to suggest that most people do not think beyond the obvious when it comes to one of the most potentially offensive parts of all of the Torah, which is the notion of impurity. Why do women have impurity when they have their periods, right? Why do they need to go and get clean and wash it off? Why do you get impure? Why when you get sick, you have an infection, suddenly you've got impurity and you can't be with the rest of us? Boy, that's a horrible thing. That's a mean thing. In other words, the proper translation of tameh or tuma, the state of impurity or impurity itself, te'uma, is the proper translation should be impurity, which I don't think is a good translation at all. And many scholars would agree with me. Don't read it as impurity. Well, then what is it? Ickiness. Well, or as one famous rabbi once put it, most people think of it as cooties. It's cooties. So someone's got cooties, you know what? A woman did childbirth, she's got the cooties. You've got an infection, you got the cooties. You have a wound that won't heal, got the cooties. You touched a dead body, cooties. So all the things that, so it is a male-centered disgust with things that are icky and that give you cooties. And therefore, it's this thing, it's dirty. It's a dirtiness. And I'm not going to be able to prove to you that just as I can't prove to you about any of it, that anyone who thinks that's true, I can show you right now that they're totally wrong and they don't know what they're talking about. Just as I said last week with Revelation, if one says, I disagree with everything Rav Nadav's quoting from all these philosophers, and this, I just think God spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting like he was on a cell phone and it was a voice, and Moses just said, well, let me write down some more, God. And if anyone poked their head in, it was a voice. And this idea that the Torah has a totally different conception of what it means to commune with God, and it's not dictation, then I can't prove that they're wrong and I'm right. So here we go. I'm not going to say it's entirely wrong. And you may already know what I'm going to say, because I can't imagine I'm the first person who came up with it. I'm not that special. So the Lord spoke to Moses saying, let's look at Leviticus 12. Go tell the Israelites, right? We did that. So Moses says, oh my gosh, I need to go tell the Israelites, when a woman at childbirth bears a male, she shall be unclean. So they use the word unclean. I don't want to use that word. She will be unclean for 7 days. She shall be unclean as at the time of her menstrual infirmity. This is definitely a misogynistic text. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. She shall remain in a state of blood purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until her period of purification is completed. And if she bears a female, she shall be unclean 2 weeks as during her menstruation. So why is it, okay, now I'll skip a little bit I'm not skipping. This continues with verse 6. On the completion of her period of purification for either son or daughter, she shall bring to the Kohen or the Levite at the entrance of the tent of meeting a lamb in its first year for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. So in our modern terms, she's sponsoring the kiddush for everybody with bagels and lox and brisket, and for the burnt offering or something. And then she's bringing a chicken wing for the sin offering. So birds back then, turtle doves were basically the way we eat chicken today. He shall offer it before the Lord and make expiation on her behalf. She shall then be clean from her flow of blood. Such are the rituals concerning her who bears a child, male or female. If, however, her means do not suffice for a sheep, so she can't afford to sponsor the kiddush, she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering. So she's poor, she's allowed to stop by KFC, 1 chicken wing for the burnt offering, 1 chicken wing, one chicken wing for God, 1 chicken wing for the priests, and she's done. So before I say the simple idea of what I think is going on here, let me share with you a counter idea to my claim. And then I'll continue with my suggestion, my proposal. So how do we understand these things? What are the things that make you impure? You touch a dead body, you're impure. You touch the things that belong to someone who just died. This is straight from the Torah. And I'm sorry I didn't have time to put together a source sheet, so you have to trust me a little bit. If you touch a dead body, then you're impure for a certain period of time. Trying to remember if it's 7 days. For the priest, it can be overnight, but it's either 1 day, 7 days, or 30 days, the way these things work. If you touch the belongings of someone who just died or who has died, with basically, I don't mean like a year later. I mean, in the words of the Torah, that are within their tent, the vessels and belongings of someone within their home after their death, you also become impure or dirty or whatever the word means. Let's just say tameh. If you have a zav can make you tameh. Zav is semen. So if a male if a male ejaculates semen, whether in a dream or through masturbation, or I'm going to wait for the next one, is whether it's through intercourse, a question, then they are now ritually impure, usually just for the day. So it's usually until nightfall, and then they can bathe. If it's an act of sexual intercourse, the rabbis debate this a bit. It's not clear if the semen did not escape. Is that considered a semen impurity condition? The answer is likely yes. And so if sexual intercourse has occurred, both partners in the act are impure until nightfall. And then at some point at nightfall in the morning, they wash themselves and then they're pure again. So there's that purity. And there is the menstrual period produces, while in the Torah, let's not talk about the way it's done by the Orthodox today, but in the Torah itself, for the duration of the menstrual blood coming out, the woman is in a state of impurity. Once there's no more, once the period is over, there's no waiting period. She can pretty much go directly to the mikvah, and then she's no longer in a state of impurity. That's been expanded that got expanded by the rabbis to, and then over the centuries and millennia, it kept getting expanded and expanded from the actual period of the blood to a period before, just in case, and especially a long period afterward, just to make sure. And I'm against those restrictions because I think they are adding laws to the Torah in the name of adding offense. And I think that like a typical kind of, like a typical Rav Nadav, I am skeptical of all attempts to add fences and fences around halakha because I think it obscures the meaning of the halakha originally and therefore violates the principle of adding laws to the Torah. But so you've got the period, and then if there is essentially, and I'm making this simple, if there's fluid that is oozing from you, you enter a state of impurity as pronounced by the priest. And so it largely, like we read in Leviticus already, things like wounds that are not healing, and skin infections, or other sorts of infections. And basically, it's a lot of ancient sort of priestly manuals in Leviticus, but that's really the bottom line. The bottom line is they're looking, if your wound looks like it's not oozing, then even if it's not healed, they pronounce you pure again. And so that it's the actual emission of the fluid that seems to be key. And yes, they have a sense of when you're still contagious or not, or something like that. So that's mixed into it. Okay, so that's kind of covering all the cases. So now, what is a view that I respect that's not just like, well, it's the cooties, or it's a bunch of misogyny, because it applies to men too. So, I mean, not a lot, but it still applies to men. Men are usually the ones burying dead bodies. Men can be touching vessels, and men certainly emit semen. So that, like, it's not strictly limited to misogyny. Although you can say from the childbirth one that it's clearly misogynistic, because if you have a girl, the period is longer for being impure than for a male. And so anyone who picks up Leviticus without Nadav or without thinking more broadly, clearly misogynistic. Nadav, give me a view that you think is, and I'm not reading the chats because I'm looking at my text, so if there's a chat, no, I'll get to it, but I won't hear it now, you'll have to interrupt me, is the anthropologist Mary Douglas. And I'm still to this day, having read her at the age of 21, I still struggle, so whatever this is, 22 years later, I don't know what to make of what she said. So I'll tell you what she said. I'm not going to dismiss it. It may be smarter than anything I can come up with, but there's a part of me that views it as reductionistic and not entirely right. Mary Douglas was an anthropologist who was famous for covering tribes like the Nuer, and she was British, and she came out of that anthropological tradition that I partly criticized in my treatment within this course, in my treatment of Genesis, the British anthropological tradition, but she was one of the best of them, and of course she was late 20th century. What she said is you should relate this fluid, let me say it more clearly. The human body is the symbolic image of the social body, of the corporate body. And so therefore, I'm speaking as Mary Douglas, but I have a terrible British accent. If I would quote your rabbi, Rav Nadav, what I would agree with is that he has often said that what God is and what the image of God is essentially the ecological systems in which we live. And so therefore our body is in the image of God because it's different organisms who have come together to make a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. They've created a new thing that is capable of thinking and sentience and will and discernment that was greater than just adding up the mitochondria and the organelles and the genetic material into a vat. They actually created an ecological system. And your rabbi has said before that the whole point of Exodus, when it talks about the creation of the Mishkan, the whole reason we have a synagogue, the whole reason the synagogue is like the circulatory system of the life, the nefesh life system of Judaism. The reason we need synagogues, the reason the synagogue needs everyone's support is because when the temple was functioning and in our synagogues, it is where the individuals come together to create an organism. The synagogue itself is a body. It's an organism. It has currents flowing in it of those who need aid and tzedakah because they're in a temporary state of needing redemption and help. And there's a flow to them. So some of the animals, as they're cut up and slaughtered and butchered, they get some of the food and they get some pigeons and they get some of this. And those public servants come in and they get their pieces. So that our school teachers, because the Levites were teachers, and our healthcare professionals, especially Levitical socialized medicine, that they can eat and they're not starved because they're not relying just on donations. And that you have people coming to, when someone wants to celebrate a simcha, it's not about individual families in a social contract to say, I pay my taxes, leave me the hell alone. But rather, when someone's celebrating a wedding or a bar mitzvah or a simcha, they come to the temple and they sponsor a kiddush and they feed everybody. And all you need is 52 of those, and you've got 52 kiddushes, and you have a whole community being sustained by people who are publicly sharing and celebrating. You create a community that is like a body, Mary Douglas would say. So she said that, I agree with your Rabbi Rav Nadav, that the image of God is basically a body. In fact, the Kabbalist said Adam Kadmon, the primordial Adam, was the creation of the cosmos, because the cosmos essentially could be thought of as a body, like they did as Adam Kadmon, as like a person, and you could think of the laws of physics as God's brain, and you could think of the stars and the stardust as the matter, as the flesh. And so their attitude is, she's like, Rav Nadav and I are in 90% agreement. It's a body, and therefore, what this stuff is if you see a body that is oozing fluid of life, it is disturbing, because it will inevitably, we are all imprinted with this model, consciously, subconsciously, and unconsciously. It's too disturbing to take, because it'll make us feel insecure about our society itself. Therefore, and we just read it last week, and I didn't comment on it because it was a bat mitzvah, but last week's Torah portion and more is probably the most disturbing one for me of any of them. It's the one I have the hardest time with making an apologetic excuse for, like I'm doing in this course. Because it actually said that if a serving Kohen, not the Levites, a Levite can have a skin condition, a Levite can be a hunchback, a Levite can be blind, but a serving Kohen, the one who is publicly in the middle, taking the animal, accepting your offering, giving the blessing for the community, they can't be blind. They can't have an eye poked out. They can't be disfigured, and they can't be a hunchback. They have to look the part, and I hate that. So it is definitely the part that you will not hear, I hope, ever from me, that will not be the 9th most misunderstood thing in the Torah. And I say, oh, it has a beautiful way of understanding it. You just missed the point, which is really what I'm doing in these other sessions. I disagree. I don't like it at all. But Mary Douglas would say, the reason you don't like it at all is because it doesn't fit your model, Nadav, but it fits mine, which is that if the President of the United States was at the very center of the body of society, and that when people came forth, they're streaming into the temple by the thousands on Shavuot or Pesach or Sukkot, and they're streaming out the other door, and they're making their offerings, and they're saying, my father was a wandering Aramean, and I've been blessed, and so therefore I'm going to share. And the person standing there, the President of the United States, was like a hunchback or like had oozing stuff out of their eye, it would be too disturbing, Mary Douglas writes. It would be like, I just can't take it. My only apology, and so my support for Mary Douglas is, let's be honest, for all of our inclusion, how many actors and actresses and celebrities are hard to look at? I mean, let's just be honest. You know, we can talk about body positivity because it's real, but like, let's say who gets the jobs? I mean, so you can ask me, it's like on some level, the most public thing you ever saw in the ancient world prior to television and radio and all of that was basically making your pilgrimage and going to the center of everything and seeing the high priest in his costume. And so if the high priest was like kind of disturbing, it could be disturbing. So that's what Mary Douglas says. She may be right. So any kind of oozing is disturbing. But I don't want to, so I say I struggle with her view. There may be things about it that are important, but there's still a part of me that thinks it's reductionistic. It is too simple. It's it's boiling something complex down to something too simple. And one of the things that I would say about that, and she kind of includes this, is that in the Torah, there's no question that in the ancient world, body fluids have power. So for example, in the famous case of Moses and the bridegroom becoming the bridegroom of blood, it looks like Moses is really, really, really sick. And his wife Zipporah circumcises their son and takes the blood and puts it on Moses, and it heals Moses. The mezuzah on our doorpost, which on some level superstitiously is meant to protect us, still has its roots in spreading the blood on the doorposts to keep the angel of death out, or God out, the plague out. So that the blood of life, semen is the blood of life, menstrual fluid is the blood of life, straight up blood is the blood of life. And yeah, you and I don't think of like pus as the blood of life, but nevertheless, if we think of the body as a set of tubes, the things coming out of the body are including life juices and childbirth juices and placenta and all of that. It has power. So it's not, the one thing Mary Douglas I'm not sure about is that I don't know if it should be related to things that we find disgusting or things that we find disturbing, because the actual examples of these things that make you impure are not exactly dirty things like, ew, I can't believe when I finally made my way to the high priest, yet, you know, he had stuff oozing out of his eye. Like I've lost my faith in the nation of Israel. This can't be right. This is too disturbing to my unconsciousness, my subconscious. My attitude is, but wait, I mean, like these other examples are actually power fluids, like they're life-giving fluids, and we have this whole thing in the ancient world that they're powerful. So that's the one criticism I have. And now I'm going to give you my answer, and then I'm going to go to questions. So my answer for this is simply this. I'm going to apply the principle of the philosophical school, you're getting all my philosophy, of pragmatism. Pragmatism is, to me, one of the greatest, it's not the same thing as when I say someone is pragmatic. It is a specific philosophical approach. It largely American. It is, some people say it is the only uniquely American philosophical movement in the history of philosophy, and it is unbelievably brilliant. It's the best. So mainly started by Charles Sanders Peirce, brilliant American philosopher, made famous by William James, the brother of Henry James. And William James, one of America's greatest philosophers, established philosophy department in so many ways at Harvard. And so if you read William James's books on pragmatism, Charles Sanders Peirce, and then in the late 20th century, late 20th century, Richard Rorty, who might consider to be the most brilliant philosopher of the last half of the 20th century, pragmatism is the view of this. When you are trying to understand a concept that seems really metaphysical, God, holiness, the good, goodness, value, ritual impurity, with spirit. When you're trying to understand, it's not abstract, but metaphysical, like concepts that are like, what the hell do you mean by that? How the hell do you define that? Sin. So they're like, oh, sin. Do I put someone with sin under a microscope and try to figure out what sin is? Do I try to say, oh, show me the things that have God on it so I can investigate what is the definition of God so that if God is in the world, I know where to look. Their attitude is, you're not going to make a lot of progress because the history of philosophy hasn't, trying to define metaphysical concepts. But what you could do, if you really want to understand them, is make a list of what practical consequences they have in the real world. So rather than say, well, I need to know exactly what this sin is, like if you have sin or you're clean of sin, what am I looking for? What's different? Their attitude is, what's the practical difference it would make, whether someone has sin or someone doesn't have sin? And so if the answer is, well, if someone has sin, they need to go to 12-step because they need some help in figuring out how to get rid of their addiction. Or they need a psychologist, or they need a rabbi, or they need a teacher to show them, you know what, you keep screwing up in this way in the world. I don't know. You keep putting plastic out into the universe and it's just filling up and killing the fish. Like, you need to be educated. So like one thing could be they need retraining or something. So then they say, don't define sin by looking for it under a microscope or trying to define it as what is in this metaphysical property. Say, sin is a word you use to describe people that need retraining. And then you're much more likely to understand it. So let me apply it here. And it's true of God too, by the way, and that's a complicated one. Instead of saying tameh is an impurity, like a dirtiness, or an impurity that attaches to the body. It's cooties. You can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't touch it, but it's the cooties in there. But it's an invisible, and if I touch the dead body, oops, I just contracted some of the invisible cooties from the dead body into me. And that's really the way most scholars have been trying to treat this for millennia. And I take a different approach, which is, I'm going to ask the pragmatic question, which is, what difference does it make that I am in a state of impurity? Instead of looking for the cooties or saying I've got them, so if I have cooties, what does it mean? So what is the actual practical consequences in the world for being in a state of impurity? The answer is, you are in timeout. The only effect of I should say the only, there could be others. The main, especially with disease, just in terms of like you get treatment, but the practical effect of if you have tameh, or if you are declared in a state of tameh, what does it mean? It means you can't join in public activities. Period. If you are, in addition to that, you are designated as having tsarat, you're designated as having a disease or possibly infectious disease, there could be an additional separation that you're not even allowed to shelter in place within the camp. Because in many cases you are, you just have to stay in your tent. You can't be in public. But the only thing that tameh means is you can't join in public activities, period. For this reason, most biblical scholars will insist that English translations never be like this one. They never say that you have infirmity or that you are unclean 7 days. They insist that you add an extra word. So people like Rabbi Doberson will use it. Why is Rabbi Doberson adding, they shall be ritually unclean 7 days? They shall be ritually unclean at the time of a period, because they specifically say that the words do not mean dirty, and they don't mean impure as a semi-physical or metaphysical property. They are very clear, even the Bible scholars, of it meaning that you are in the category of not being allowed to go to work or school or synagogue. You are in the category of not being able to go to the shuk. You can't go to the marketplace. You can't go to work. You can't go to the synagogue. You can't go to a party. You can't go to a wedding reception. And so therefore, really simply put, I translate, and you've probably heard it before, I just think the word tameh should be translated as timeout. I like it because it seems like it almost makes sense, right? Like tameh, timeout. And then what would we think if we read all of these things differently? And I'm almost done. So I just want to give you a heads up. We're at 12:39. Now let's look back at the categories again. And maybe we can notice something that speaks to the modern soul. Instead of picking up Leviticus and being like, this is the most offensive thing I've ever read in my life, what would it mean to pick it up and say, I'm struggling with these same issues? So what are the things, when I say I am fighting for justice in the United States of America in 2020, and these are the issues that I'm going to pick for my candidates that I'm going to vote for in primaries and election, what's in my soul to change the body politic and society? Well, I'll tell you what they are. I'm in favor of paid family leave. I think that someone who gives birth should not have to go back to work. And I think that they should be able to stay at home. And I think they should be paid for that. I think they should get a childbirth timeout. And I think we should support them in it. I don't think they should. So yes, I guess you could say that, but Nadav, you're saying they should have the option of going back to work. You know what? Maybe I'm with the Torah on this one. Maybe they shouldn't have an option, because I don't know about you, but I don't actually believe when they tell grocery store workers, you know what, or nurses, you know what, if you're scared of coming in during the coronavirus, it's okay, you don't have to, we won't count it against you. I don't believe it. I don't believe that they won't count it against them. I think that's a lie we want to believe. So what I think in this case is, I think there should be a rule that you don't go back to work, because I think people would discriminate and say, well, you know, Lynn went back to work after 1 week and you're taking 2 months. You know, I think that people notice. So that if you say that this is basically childbirth timeout, and if you say, well, Nadav, you're not handling the fact that for a girl, it's longer than for a boy. Yeah, I'm not handling that right now. Like, I mean, I do think in that case, it has to do with the fact that because a woman is naturally a vehicle of the life fluids. And I mentioned that, like, that's a real thing in the ancient world, that blood and menstrual fluid and semen are all considered to be like the part of the miracle of life magic. That yes, I think that probably the childbirth, the maternity leave over the birth of a daughter is greater because of an ancient association with women as life givers. I do. But for whatever reason, it is maternity leave. Well, Nadav, give me some other examples. You know, you're sick, you have an infection. You know what? Required medical leave. Like, I'm sorry, but you can't come into work. Now, I know that I have sick leave, right? If I get sick, I can call in. But you would be pretty shocked to know that according to most studies, people that work at restaurants, Chipotle, your waitress, professional surveys that have been done of them in private, that the vast majority of them say that they worked this past year, even when they were infectiously sick. Like, they would be vomiting in the bathroom and then making your burrito and then bringing you your order. So and because they can afford not to come in, and they can't afford, I already got sick 2 months ago, I'm going to tell them I'm sick again, I'm not going to get a promotion, and I'm going to get fired. So that the Torah then adds in, if you're vomiting or you got like a wound that won't heal, you have required medical leave and you're going to be tended to. But no, you can't go to work. No, you can't go to school. No, you can't go to the party. No, you can't go to the wedding. So I just want to cover the other examples. I'm going to go to the chat function. So maybe I'll go to the chat function now so I can see everybody. I'm going to stop my share, and I'm going to put, I want to be able to see the rest of you. And so childbirth timeout, maternity leave, required sick leave, no, and again, no options. Not like, well, you can if you want. No, Torah's like required. dead body. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we read, maybe it was just a week ago, in Emor starts, pardon me. Last week's parashah started with the fact that the high priest, if the high priest has an immediate relative die and they are on active duty, they should not touch the dead body because they need to be in a state of purity to fulfill the temple functions. And almost everyone reads that, it's so cruel. It's so cruel. The high priest can't care for the dead. It's not saying in all cases, but it is saying basically for the period that the high priest is on duty or the Kohen is on duty, they can't immediately bury their dead because then they wouldn't be able to do their function. But that's an exception. In general, all of the Kohens and everyone, someone dies in your family, you get bereavement leave. So it is assumed that your responsibility as a family member is to bury someone's dead, to bury your kin. And if you're not able, someone's kin is not near them, or they don't have any next of kin, then those who volunteer to do so, who are asked by the family or last wishes to do so, they get the bereavement leave. They get the death leave. So we have to bury our kin. And those who take responsibility, it's not that I got the cooties from the corpse. I think all of that investigation goes down the wrong avenue, but most scholars go down that wrong avenue. And I think that the pragmatists are right, which is this is about a category of interaction. It's about the consequences of being labeled as such. It is not about the cause of the label per se. So that you have bereavement leave. And then if you bury your dead, and you also have the Shiva, you have the 7-day bereavement leave, and then you have a 30-day period of leave. And then you say, well, why did the vessels in someone's tent give you cooties? And I'm looking at all of you, and I know you're thinking to yourself, has anyone ever had to clear out, mom's apartment? Has anyone ever had to clear out a loved one's home of the things that they left when they died? I think that is a period in which you need to be off of work. I think that is one of the most emotionally intense things that happens. By the way, it's also physically intense. It is really, really, really time consuming and draining to go through someone's closets and garages and books and to try to figure out this needs to go to the school and that needs to go to the rabbi and this I think we just recycle and this goes to Goodwill and we have to make calls to see if anyone wants this and we have to make calls to see we should have a whole rite of passage for it. It's more intense than bar mitzvah. It should be added to our lists of the major life cycle events. And I think it's amazing that the Torah is saying, when you touch those objects, you need a week off. You gotta have a week off. You can't go there. You can't go to work the next day. You can't come home from work and do this. And so I think that it is recognizing something very real that I've experienced. And so I think that that deserves its own timeout from public obligation and interaction. And then the sex one is a complicated one even for the rabbis for a seminal emission, but it's only till nightfall. So I mean, that's a separate discussion, but that's not where you get, I mean, to the extent in which you are not able to touch you're not able to go to synagogue until the next day, or something like that. It's not a very long period to be discussing. So, and then in terms of Nida, in terms of a woman's period, I think that it is a required period of abstinence for both parties. And while it may restrict women who wish to engage in sexual activity during their period, and I mean, it's not giving them a woman's choice, it does give them protection from men who would wish to have sexual access during that period that maybe a woman does not wish to have would not wish to be sexually available during that period. So it is a timeout from sexual interaction. And so those who focus on the idea that it's just a way of calling women icky and dirty and unclean, and therefore they have to go wash off, is not picking up on the fact that going and washing off is a ritual action to distinguish between you're basically going back to work, you're going back to school, you're going back to family parties and gatherings from a period of getting time alone. And we know the books about Rachel's tent and Maggie Anton and all this stuff that, you know, there have been women who've really embraced that time to have a break from men. But there are also women who find it offensive. And I don't want to minimize those who find that break offensive. So my translation of tuma is timeout. Or tameh, if someone says, "Oh, you're in a state of tameh," that means you're in a state of grief leave, medical leave. The other ones I should say in a way, sexual timeout during nidah. A man also has sexual timeout. Remember that if a man has an emission of semen, he's also then in a timeout until the next day or until he washes, which is the next day. So those are some of the things that I think are real issues in our time. And I think that it is a case where we can turn Leviticus around, rethink the word with the best of what scholars have told us, which is it is a ritual state, not a physical state. And when you say, well, we have something called metaphysical, which is a fancy word we use to describe something you can't see, hear, or touch, but is sort of like physical, you end up with no adequate explanation. Mary Douglas probably does the best you can do, but even she's not really dealing she ends up not really giving you a comprehensive explanation. And so that takes us to 1250. And so I want to see, Amanda says, I worked in the service industry for 15 years. And it's true, we were talking about medical workers and health leave. But the idea that the Torah is saying that we're just going to make it a thing that you're required. Like I don't have a choice as your boss to say, you know what, we don't have enough people on the shift. If you can work, I'd appreciate it if you came in. I don't have a choice. In fact, it's taken out of my hands. The Levites basically deal with it. Most people self-report, right? So we're relying on people trusting. But the answer is that like, you just can't. I mean, if someone's sick, they're sick. And that's the thing. And I know that Amanda also said she was horrified. I am too about, I do think that, yeah, I mean, I don't want to go off topic, but the issue about whether a hunchback or someone blind can be the Kohen, I think it's highly problematic. And I would like to, I think it's worthy of a really good conversation sometime about whether that attitude, which I hate, is nevertheless an attitude that is widespread in our own society. So rather than just criticize the ancient Israelites for it, maybe worth looking in our own hearts about the way we view celebrities and others. You know, I remember, you know, if you're 33, or I forget, there was an actress, I forget who it was, who said, you know, 33 for me means I'm thinking of good roles for maybe 1 or 2 more years. If I were a male, it would mean I'm thinking of good roles for another 30 or 35 years. You know, so it's not like something we don't practice in our own society. So you can use the chat function, or you are welcome to unmute yourself, and you're welcome to challenge me. I'm not saying I'm so smarty pants as I figured it all out, but it is the way I think about one of the 8 most misunderstood parts of the Torah. And also, if you got to go, I hope you at least had something to eat. I know. Okay, anyway, I'm gonna turn off the. I'm gonna stop.